What's up everyone, D2 from DTwoAOV.com here with a review of the Taiwan server June 2019 patch. This came out on June 11th, but that was just 22 days after the big patch on Taiwan and 10 or 11 days after that particular patch came out in the West, so to be frank, I wasn't really in the mood to go over it at the time, particularly because I was still finishing up my tier list. So I did that first, and now let's go over this. The benefits of me doing it a little bit late, it gives me some perspective on Yina, and this is part of the complaints I have about this patch coming out so quickly, is that you kind of have to let the dust settle on the old patch before you know what's going on with the meta, and I feel like the developers didn't quite let that happen. And the other part was that it's becoming somewhat clear that the developers are only really keeping an eye on the Taiwan server, and as we've seen for the last couple of heroes to come out, first Kaeya and now Yina, Taiwan aren't exactly they're not 100% reliable when it comes to what heroes are strong and which heroes are weak and what kind of balance changes should be made. Like for instance, Florentino came out quite a while ago. It came out on all the other servers before Taiwan, and then when he finally came out on Taiwan, they decided to put more nerfs in than they already had put in, because they're like, now that they could experience him for themselves, like, okay, now we have the real information in their eyes, and so now we can nerf him again. And it's like, I think that's the reason why we see Florentino nerf after Florentino nerf, because they weren't able to really experience him themselves on the real server, which is Taiwan. And yeah, that might have been true back in the day, but I don't think that's true anymore. I think that Thailand is just as good of a server. I think that the knowledge in the West, at the very least, is just as good as that of Taiwan. And there's no better indication of that than the fact that Kaeya was out on Taiwan for well over a month, and their initial reaction to her being out on Taiwan was to buff her because they didn't think she was strong enough. And meanwhile, 2 weeks after she was out in the West, people knew that she was absolutely busted, and then they went back and had to nerf her once they realized that, oh crap. So it was kind of like a backwards, like instead of Taiwan teaching the rest of the world how to play, it was the exact opposite, right? Like the Kaeya was completely owning on other servers, and then people in Taiwan were like, wait a second, maybe we should play Kaeya, and then they realized that she was broken. And it seems like the same thing has happened in this patch. Spoiler alert, Yina got buffed here, and this is after like 1 week of struggling on the Taiwan server, but even after just 1 week on the rest of the servers, people have already realized how strong of a hero she is. Obviously, part of that has to do with the fact that there are a lot of Chinese Americans, or Chinese, whatever country you want to put in other servers, and so they've had Yina on King of Glory for quite a while, so they know exactly how to play with her. But still, I think my point still stands, is that you can't really look at Taiwan to be the sole indicator of what the meta should be. And also that this patch is coming out a little bit too quickly, in my opinion. One thing I did mention here is that they could have, it's possible that they got this patch as quickly as possible out in order to give teams as much time to practice at the 2019 AWC, but even though this patch came out 8 days ago in Taiwan, there's no indication it's going to come out on other servers in time for the AWC, which is, today's the 19th, so it's like 8 days away. Like, I don't really see this patch coming out on those servers, which means that most likely AWC is going to be played on the past patch. So maybe, I mean, even my theory might be of having it out before the AWC is just completely wrong, in which case it makes almost completely zero sense to have this patch out. Almost to the point where in the past patches on Taiwan, there's been like a small patch and a bigger patch, and then in the bigger patch, the smaller patch is combined with it and then packaged and sent to the Western servers. So like for instance, if there was a big patch in January and then a smaller patch in February, or sorry, let me start over. Let's say, okay, so there's a big patch in January that went to everyone, right? And then in February, there was a smaller patch, and then March was a big patch, and that goes to everyone. That's included with the smaller patch to everyone. So these smaller patches don't get sent to the other servers until they're packaged with a bigger patch. And this patch is actually, it changes 14 heroes. So it's actually not that insignificant. And it's just kind of bizarre to me because they're making like these pretty relatively big changes if you consider everything. And we might not even use these at the AWC. So yeah, those are my thoughts. And, you know, complaining aside, let's just go over them. These changes will perhaps make their way west, but they could also realize what the changes have, or maybe like the meta changes just by themselves, just from the prior patch, will change things up enough that maybe some of these changes are reverted or, you know, sent back a little before they go west. Like this has happened before, where heroes have there's been a change and like a slight change back, and then the change that ends up going west ends up being like the half change, right? I think it happened with Lynn as well, you know, once upon a time. So keep that in mind, that all these changes might not go to the west in exactly this form. They might make yet more changes in the future before that happens. Anyway, dang, stuffed up. Making 2 videos in a row is hard. All right, let's go to the map changes. They reduced the experience from killing the Abyssal Dragon by 250 points. So basically, 50 less per each hero. I do not know exactly how much experience it takes to get to certain levels. Maybe I should go retroactively back to the patches and see how much experience you get just from what they write in those patch notes. That's the only really way you can tell. I think I remember one time that they gave like a slight buff to one of the minions in like the mid, so that it would help you get to level 2 faster as a mage. It was like, but even with that, it's impossible to tell. So I don't really know how much this hurts for the team that gets it. I suppose they don't want to have like this massive situation like you have a lot of times in professional matches, where the team who gets the first Abyssal Dragon get their level 4s first, and then they immediately just snowball the team fight because it's all level 4 versus all level 3. So I suppose they don't want that, like that defining of a break, and the game just completely ends right there, which I guess I can be behind. The time to cast the Drake after you kill the Darkslayer has gone for 9 seconds, 6 seconds. I think I'm on board with this because a lot of times a team will kind of desperately take the Darkslayer and then get completely wiped, but they'll come back on the field and then still have the same push as they did before, because they're able to push out the waves and then release the Drake at the very last second when they have everything kind of restored to their favor. And now you can't really do that anymore, right? If you get wiped, then it's a real big deal against you and for the team that did the wiping. So I am actually for that. And then the damage to towers was reduced once more. They did a lot of reduction in the last patch, and I didn't really notice it, to be honest. It still seemed like it was just as strong as it was before. So, and also like a lot of the balance changes that they make to things around the Abyssal Dragon haven't really been accurate. Especially like the buff that they mentioned after you kill the pre-enraged Abyssal Dragon doesn't seem to align with the numbers that they mentioned. But in any case, it looks like it's a little bit weaker. It's like it's not all that much weaker, so it's not that big of a deal. But I guess it's something. You won't be able to immediately have the Drake be super impactful especially when it first spawns. Anyway, let's get to the actual hero balance changes. And like I mentioned, I do this in all of the patches. Basically, -5 is like ridiculous. 5 is ridiculous in the other direction. I never actually given someone a -5 or 5. The biggest I've given someone was a 4, which was for Fennec in the last patch. And he is actually in these patch notes as well. So let's move on to our first hero, which is Ignace. And Ignace, so in the developers' notes, they mentioned that she wasn't great levels 1 through 3, and she really relied on having her ultimate. So they made her kind of early game a little bit stronger. So every level she gains 33 more HP, and her base HP regen for 5 seconds is 56. And the funny thing is, the developers' notes, again, they mentioned that, oh, in the week since she's come out, she hasn't really been that strong. And it's like, what are you talking about? You got to look at the hero for longer than that. And obviously, in the 1 week that she's been out in Western servers, she's been absolutely dominant. So it's just kind of funny how things have not flip-flopped, but how things have shifted, and how you know, Taiwan isn't the only country or the only server who can, you know, really analyze the meta on the proper scale. Anyway, let's talk about these numbers. So even with the max HP buff here, she starts off with by far the least HP of any assassin warrior in the game, and that includes Necroth. Like, she's like 150 below like even Necroth. So all this does is make it so that once she gets to level 15, she's around like Crickneck level. Like basically the same with most assassin warriors, but not warrior assassins. However, this number here brings her higher than almost all warriors, with the exception of Wonder Woman, who has an extremely high HP regen for some reason. But this is even higher than Arthur's, to give you an idea. So from now on, if you are Yina, you will have a lot more HP regen. So if you're in lane and you get a little bit low, you can just kind of stand there and heal a decent amount. That's something. I mean, it's a relatively. I mean, if you combine both of these, I mean, 33 per. If you multiply that by 14, it's like 450-ish. So that is a pretty big deal. It's like having an extra like Spirit Longinus worth of HP. This is a kind of a big deal as well. I mean, 12 per second right from the beginning of the game. So I gave her a 2. It's a reasonable buff here. All right, next is Assefa. So Assefa, her movement speed reduction on her water spirits got moved down from 50 the entire game to 30 to 50. And the cooldown has gone from 6 to 5 seconds. This hurts for the mage version of Assefa quite a bit. I mean, it obviously hurts both, whether you're playing support or mage, but they hurt in kind of different ways, because the mage version, if you're playing her as a mage, she is decent at dueling in the early game, but not very good at clearing waves, which makes her a bit weak in the early game. Comparatively speaking, especially if you're going off against, you know, one of the backline mages like Kali, who can just clear very, very quickly. So it hurts her and it hurts her in a way in which that it makes her weaker parts even weaker as a mage. As a support, she's very annoying, constantly getting, and she does more damage as a support than most other supports, because, you know, she's part mage, and so this brings her relatively strong early game as a support, where she's able to just constantly kind of bully people out and provide more damage from the support role that people are used to. That brings her some of her strength down from that part into you know, lower levels. So as a support, this weakens her strength. As a mage, this weakens her weakness, if you want to think of it that way. The most annoying thing about this, though, is they actually raise her mana cost. Now, usually they lower mana cost because they want heroes to be more fun to play and less clunky and less frustrating, but this makes it even worse. She already had mana issues. You always had to go back, whether it's as a support or as a mage, so them raising the mana cost is very, very frustrating, and I'm honestly perplexed as to why. I feel like this could have been good enough on itself. Alright, let's go on. Oh, and I gave her a minus 1.5 for that. Wasn't quite enough for a minus 2, but I felt like it was more than a minus 1, because you're really, I mean, hurling your early game, making her go back to base all the time, it's kind of frustrating. Alright, let's go on to Ignace. So Ignace, he had his damage buffed by 25 base, and then 5% ability power, which is obviously almost 0 at the beginning of the game, because they start with 0 other than your Arcana. And as you build it up, even if you have 1600 ability power, that goes to about 80, and then plus the 25 is 105. So even if you have ridiculous ability power, you're still doing 105 per fire crash in the late game, and then people have, you know, plenty of HP to withstand that. So even if with lots of resets, it's not that big of a deal. I would say that the 25 in the early game is, you know, just as impactful, if not more impactful, on your opponent's health total, especially because you can get a bunch off on a single target, your mage counterpart who doesn't have much HP. So yeah, it's not that huge of a buff. Even if you get like, you know, 4 or 5 in a row, it's in the early game, it's still, you know, 100, 125. And if you get 4 or 5 off in the late game, it's only an extra 400, 500 when they have a ton more HP and a ton more defense. So not that big of a deal. I would say this is just as big of a deal as the cooldown reduction that you see here. It's just as big of a deal as Firecrest, because having this an extra second earlier, especially because you're going to usually, I would imagine, go for the Firecrest first since you're spamming that a lot, or you know, skill that at first. So all these early game extra seconds of cooldown is very, very nice, and getting to use that, you know, sometimes it can completely change the game if you have it 1 second earlier. So I would say that's just as big of a deal, and together I give him, you know, an okay score with 1.5. It's not huge, but it's something. All right, next is Florentino. So when you pop your ult, other enemies cannot CC you, and they also do 30 or 50% reduced damage, which is now 30%. It's something, I guess. It's like, because usually, I mean, you can obviously duel anyone anytime you want. You don't actually need your ultimate. And sometimes you even pop your ultimates, you know, 1v1 just to get the extra flowers or get the extra damage off or extra healing or what have you. So in that case, it literally does nothing. And if you're within 3, you can probably still get your kills off, especially if you're far ahead. This only matters if you're like 1v5ing and you're like, you can't really 1v5 anymore, even if you're super far ahead. Or maybe if you're super duper far ahead, you can. But, and like if you're 1v3, you can't be like slightly ahead and take a 1v3. It's one of those things where it's like, it makes a tiny difference, but in the end, I only gave him a -0.5 for it. All right, let's move on to Irie, and I think this helps her more than people might imagine, especially because these days you really want to be building her full glass cannon kind of player, like a Zuka or a Scud, where you get in there, just get your kill and get out. I've been doing a little bit of testing, and if you go full glass cannon, even if you have only like 3 and 3.5 items built, you can basically 2-shot a Tel'Annas. So I would definitely recommend that. And yeah, so this helps a lot in lane as well, because you start off with that extra 50 damage. It's about 70 in the early game extra damage and 120 late game, considering that this 50 turns into 25. So, you know, even with the glass cannon, it's still only 120. So I would say much more impactful in the early game, especially if you're trying to trade with your counterpart. I mean, one of the biggest complaints about Irie these days is that she has a pretty weak laning phase. She has a pretty weak time, or pretty hard time against most other DS laners now. So having the cooldown reduction on this and having the extra damage is super nice. She's still not going to be able to really duel anyone. She's going to still be doing a lot of hitting and running, which helps to have this cooldown lower as well. So yeah, she'll be better. She'll be more competent in the early game, which maybe allows her to get more farmed in the late game, and then maybe she'll be able to do what she's supposed to do, which is you know, get nice and farmed up and take out the backline in team fights, and just be annoying like a Necroth, just running around and cutting waves and stuff like that. So not like a massive buff, but I gave her a healthy 2 for that. All right, next is Terra. So it used to be that so when they completely reworked Terra like about a year ago, this was 8%. And then this was 6%. And then they buffed this, or sorry, they buffed this to 9%. And they also buffed her first ability. So I did the math, and basically the equilibrium used to be like 40 something percent, like low 40%, when these numbers were 6 and 8. And that number moved to 53%, and now it's 54.5%. However, you actually do want to be pretty low as Terra, and because this is, you know, 6 and 5 versus 9 and 8, because there's a 10% difference, that means that when you're exactly at 50%, that's the threshold. That's not the threshold. I mean, not the threshold. The turning point for when the new version will provide less positive or less net gain in HP, right? So when you're low, for instance, if you have 10% health, then the new version will provide 2.4% less healing. So for instance, if you have, you know, 5,000 maximum HP, then the new version will provide about 120 less healing, which is kind of a big deal if you think about it, right? Like, that's the difference. That's not like the total healing. You're not healing 120 total. You're healing 120 less. in the new version. So that's pretty painful, especially because you want to be, you want to be constantly low as Terra in order to get your damage off. I mean, obviously there's less experienced players with Terra who prefer not to damage themselves as much and like this kind of prefer this new version where they're not hurting themselves from higher health. But I would say that most Terra players like to be low, or the good Terra players, like for instance Nick here, who wrote the guide for me, they like to be low, and so therefore they prefer that that they're able to damage themselves more to get there, and then they can kind of bait people out and heal when they're low and do more damage that way as well. So I think I would say that this is definitely a nerf. I think that somewhere there was a graphic that said it was a rework, but I definitely feel like it's a nerf to her because she wants to be able to heal more when she is low, and now she is healing less, and she's unable to damage herself in order to deal more damage. This whole thing, like, so I guess I could explain this part. So 5% is consumed when using your first or second ability, 10% when using your ultimate. This is not really that big of a deal. You can't kill yourself because it's our percentage of remaining HP. It's not that big of a deal when you're low, and 2% when you're especially you want to use your ultimate when you're getting low anyway. So it's almost completely inconsequential, this 8 to 10% for using your ultimate. Right. So I gave her -2 because kind of annoying to not have that extra health one though. Max, let's go to Max. So this is funny. They finally fixed the thing where if you spam your 2, if you've ever played Max, if you spam your 2, it will accidentally make you use the second cast of smooth moves. Whereas now you can, no matter how much you spam it, it's not going to make you go back, which is very, very nice. And I took a video for you so you can see that. So on the left side, you can see on both versions, I'm spamming the 2 button, but only in the old version does he accidentally go back, right? And if you're wondering, if you want to spam it, if you want to go forward and then immediately go back again, you can still do that. You just have to keep spamming after, and which is basically like how every other ability works in the game. And it was so frustrating before because I would, even after hundreds of games on Max, I would still screw up and spam it because you're used to spamming abilities, and then you'd be going the wrong direction, and then when you try to do it correctly and just tap it to make sure that you didn't go back the wrong direction, sometimes it wouldn't go off, and then you feel like a dummy. Anyway, so that is super nice. And I actually I was so happy about it, I gave him 1.5, even though it's just a bug fix. Alright, next is Yorn. Fix a bug that caused the Fear Shot to deal extra damage. I don't know what that is. I don't know if it's a big deal. It could be a very big deal, I'm not sure. There's sure sometimes when Yorn does ridiculous burst damage, but I think that's intentional. Anyway, Heavenly Barrage. So the radius was reduced by 50 units, which obviously means that's 100 units for the diameter. And if you do the math, it's actually 150,000 square units reduction. But if you actually use normal measurements, like if you convert this to 5 meters and 4.5 meters, the reduction is 15 square meters, which if you think about it, is quite a lot. It's a kind of a big deal. It goes from like, I think it was like 78 square meters to 63 square meters. So it's a big deal. It's a lot smaller, even though you're only reducing the radius by 50. And if you go, and I don't know if you guys have seen it. I can't really show you now because I didn't take a video, but it's noticeably smaller. And I know you guys have dealt with that stupid circle, and it does so much damage, and you can't like hide anywhere. It always gets you. So I actually gave him a pretty hefty score on this one, a pretty hefty -2, even though it's just the radius on his 2, and even though that's not even really his strong point, right? His strong point is obviously bursting people down once he starts going, but the fact it's just so annoying in the early game that I feel like it has so much more of an impact than Yorn players will even realize. When people are able to just stand out of the way of that annoying freaking thing. Anyway, maybe I'm wrong, but it just felt good to give it the -2 because that freaking circle. You can tell I don't play Yorn much. I just play against him. Anyway, let's move on to Tel'Annas and Eagle Eye. So deals equal magic and physical damage, meaning that these numbers are doubled basically. That said, obviously, in most cases you're going to be dealing more damage or more magic damage than physical damage, so you know, not really doubled, just kind of sort of. And then the music, so the movement speed reduction was also went from 6% to 4%, and this stacks up to 5 times, so the maximum stacks goes from 30% to 20%. So if you do the math, if you consider what Tel's normal build is, she typically builds a decent amount of attack damage, and equates to about 10, you know, times 2 in the early game, per attack. And so obviously if you get like a 5 attacks off, that's like 100, kind of sort of depending on their defense, and 25 times 2 in the late game. So a lot bigger deal in the early game, I would say. Like this 3% doesn't really equate to a whole lot, and obviously like this 5 here, just this 5 right here is kind of a bigger deal than the fact that you get the extra 3%. So yeah, actually, if you do the math, it's 5 plus 5 obviously because it's 10, but in the early game that's a much bigger deal. And the movement speed reduction is also a big deal in the early game. It's a bigger deal in the early game as well, because in the early game it's really powerful to get those extra shots off. Like if you pop your Eagle Eye and hit the opposing marksman with one of them, then you can keep going. That 6% does a great deal. And if you get 2 shots off, then obviously now they're slowed 12%, and you basically can get like 5 or 6 shots off, and then they're completely chunked, and you're completely on the lane, and then now you're on your way to starting to snowball the game, because all Tel needs is to have a safe way to clear her minion wave, and then she, you know, is able to get to her items very, very quickly. So I think an underrated reason why Tel'Annas is so strong right now is not because she scales well into the late game. Like there's many heroes who scale well into the late game, but she can safely scale into the late game. That's because she has the crazy range on her Eagle Eye, and now that it does less damage, you're gonna feel it as Tel'Annas. Not all that much, because it's not a huge damage reduction. She's still gonna be able to do what she does, right? She's still slow. She still has massive range, but it'll have a tiny impact, you know, noticeable enough for me to give her a minus 1.5 here. Let's move on to Violet. Oh, I should mention before we get too far. So the developers note, I didn't think it was worth writing here, but the developers notes there was kind of this kind of half-assed mention of all the marksmen. It's like, oh, between the extra, the big melee minion and the way they can farm. And by the way, did you know that farming in Chinese is pig breeding? I mean, the gaming term farming. Obviously, there's a word for farming in Chinese, but the actual term for farming in English, as referring to, you know, getting your hero fed, you know, off of minions usually, is called pig breeding in Chinese. That's so strange. Anyway. So between like farming and the extra, you know, melee minion and how good marksmen are, they were like, well, we didn't want to. And also they mentioned like the cheaper crit items these days. Like, okay, you wanted to reduce the power of some of the crit marksmen, and then increase the power of some of the weaker ones, which is kind of weird because some of the weaker ones were based on crit. Anyway, I just want to throw that out there. So, Violet, tactical fire, 5 seconds to 4.5 seconds. I just saw this and I laughed. I was like, "Are you kidding me?" The very previous patch from like 20 days earlier, they're like, "We wanna make sure that, you know, not everything revolves on tactical fire, so we're gonna move her stuff around her kit," and then now that they need to buffer a little bit, like, screw it, let's just reduce tactical fire. So yeah, Violet still struggles because she's not going to be able to, you know, 100 to 0 someone, but, you know, having this tactical fire on a lower cooldown certainly helps her for that cause. And even on the one hand, it is only 0.5 seconds. It's like a tiny amount of time, but on the other hand, that does equate to 10% of her cooldown time overall. And also, it's like her best ability. It's the reason why she's like reasonably good in the first place. So put those together, and I gave her 1.5. It's like, if it was any other hero, then it would be like a 0.5 or 1, because this is a small cooldown difference. But like this one there's like a 1 for the fact that it's such a small cooldown difference, and a 2 for the fact that it's freaking Violet, it's freaking tactical fire, so you take the average of that. Alright, let's move on to Fennec. So, he got a bunch of buffs, even though he just got completely reworked and slash buffed in the last patch. Attack speed for level 2-3%. So do the math. That gets him from 28% to 42% by the end of the game. And 14% is no laughing matter. That's a nice little dagger's worth of extra attack speed by level 10. I didn't talk about this base movement speed in this paragraph, but anytime you buff base movement speed, it also buffs any items that are based or that are percentage based, because the only items that affect base movement speed are boots. And so if you get something like a Slick Sting, then that 7% is based on your base movement speed. So this basically buffs all the percentages of all the other items. So it's only 10, so it's not like a huge deal, but you know, I think you're definitely gonna feel this, especially because Fennec really needs to be played very, very aggressive, in my opinion, like much more like Tulin, because of the way his kit is set up. So yeah, but this is a big deal. So 40% to 50%. Depending, like Fennec doesn't really have his build completely decided yet. I think there's a lot of people who are in love with the just going almost full crit with him. But you know, I just kind of guesstimated that's about 3 to 80 extra AoE damage, which is kind of a big deal if you're just sitting there getting a lot of attacks off, especially because once you put up your Thief's Mark, you get a lot of extra attack speed. And also keep in mind that if you put a Thief's Mark on someone and rolling lightning over them, all this extra damage is going to be going off on them as well, just by virtue of your passive going off, because your rolling lightning procs your Thief's Mark, or procs the passive when it has Thief's Mark on them. So that's a really big deal, and it's just massive. And also the 70% AD versus minions and monsters goes to 75%, so that means you can clear even faster. So now he's going to be, you know, like even crazier as far as the early jungle clear. And I don't know, I haven't actually tested which one was faster, the new jungle speed or the old jungle speed clear time, but you know, if it did get nerfed a little bit, then you know, he gets a little bit he starts to make up some of that ground with this. So I think he's really strong. I think this buffs make him a lot stronger as well. Oh, the other thing is that, so they fixed a bug. the base damage did not grow with ability level, and I think this is something that this goes all the way back to like a year and a half ago. And if you know the professional player Arena of Violet, you haven't seen him in the European scene for a while, but he used to be on he was on the 2018 European AWC team, and when they did like a Fennec adjustment like last year, like a year and a half ago, he was the first person to point out on Reddit that it was just a fix, right? Because they for some reason had his 1 go up with level rather than going up with skill, or rather than going up with you know, leveling up the ability. And I think like the spaghetti code came back here when they did the rework on him. That's just my opinion, or that's just my guess. So yeah, basically the extra the base damage that they wrote in the ability description just didn't go off. And I went and checked, and it's like that currently. If you go over, assuming you're not, you know, listening to this in the future, and you just go to your Tencent server and you look at Fennec's abilities and go to level, you know, 6 on your first ability, it will not be doing I think what is it, like 800 damage? So it goes from 900 damage. It goes from 500 to 900 damage in base damage. So I mean, it only goes off when you kind of detonate, quote unquote. It doesn't really explode anymore for AoE damage, but when you make the Thief's Mark go up, but that is the thing, because a lot of your kit revolves around getting your Thief's Mark off. So I mean, it's something. getting left 400 less damage is something, let me just tell you. So yeah, all that put together, I gave him a nice and healthy 2.5. I think this is actually a pretty big deal. Obviously, the fact that he didn't get as buffed as I thought he was in the previous patch, because of the fact that this is broken, means that even though I gave him the 4 in the last patch, that probably moves down to 3.5. Like either the last patch is a 4 and this is a 2, or the last patch is a 3.5 and this is a 2.5, basically, because of the fact that they didn't really properly deal with or properly do the numbers for his Thieves Mark. Anyway. It's 1:30 a.m., so I need to push through this. Alright, Hayate. So, Sturdy Kantos, they lowered this damage, and the math on that is 9 to 10 per shuriken early game and 30 late. And this is kind of interesting because 30 late is 30 times 9, assuming you have enough attack speed to get the bonus so that you get the extra shurikens. So this is 270. Whereas this is only 50, right? And I guess you could rush to 7 if you get the 75% attack speed and get it so that this is minus 70. But even though this is 270 and this is 50, I would say it's still a bigger nerf in the early game, because you really want to be able to clear the wave as quickly as possible. And if you combine this nerf with the nerf from the last patch, where he does even less damage to the third minion, it makes it a lot harder to clear the wave, and then you're kind of stuck standing there. And it's harder to duel with your opponent if you're trying to line up your shuriken with a minion wave and them. So I would say this definitely hurts more in the early game. I mean, in the late game, 270 damage. Like if you hit someone with 9 straight shurikens, then those last 3 are doing massive true damage and perhaps true crit damage. So I don't think you're going to care too much about 270 when you're just absolutely demolishing them at that point. So that's what I'm talking about when you're not really worried about this extra 270 here. So anyway, that's a reasonable deal. Just not being able to clear your waves as quickly kind of hurts you as far as you having to stay in lane a little bit longer, not being able to rotate as quickly, and perhaps you're losing duels a little bit more. But this is probably a bigger deal, the Shadow Step cooldown increase. So 5 to 6, that's a bit painful, but 6 to 8 in the late game, like 8 seconds is a long time, especially for something that's just a dash. So you can't just like willy-nilly use your dash anymore and think that's going to be up, relatively soon. Like someone who's chasing you can totally punish you. If you use your dash forward, you're not gonna have it for a long time. So you're pretty much dead in the water if you make a mistake and dash forward at that point. And you can't like just mess around and kind of juke for a little bit and have your dash up, in 6 seconds. It's 8 seconds. So it feels a lot longer than 6 seconds in game, trust me. So those together, I gave him -2. Let's move on to Slims. So this is so weird because this is one of those abilities where you kind of you always assumed that it just went from 10 to 8, or that the cooldown itself just went down as the game went along, but I guess not for Slims. It's I feel like this is something that should have been part of his kit once he was introduced to the game, but apparently it wasn't the case. And so now they finally reduced his cooldown. Is definitely worth doing. And even though like your spear is probably a little bit more valuable in the early game because you want to get those individual picks with those long spears, just coming from the bushes, still having this available is something. Particularly when you're constantly trying to throw spears to check bushes when people play the bush game in late game and try to like wipe your team, things like that. I think that this is a slightly bigger deal though, especially because you don't have to wait the entire game to get to it. It's right there right from the beginning, the extra 10% movement speed. Now this makes you move as fast as Arthur when he uses his first ability, which is pretty fast. So now you're going to be able to kite a lot better, whether it's kiting forward or backward. It allows you to get your damage in, and that's really what Slims needs, right? Because he doesn't have the greatest attack, or doesn't have the greatest range, so he needs to be acting like basically a Lindis and getting in and out of fights and constantly using as many attacks as possible without falling into danger. So I think this is a bigger deal than this, and because of that, combined, I gave him a nice healthy 2 for his buff here. And finally we have Kaeya. Her lifesteal is now 2/3 of other marksmen. I went and tested this. This applies to both the pulse cannon, or pulse shot, and rapid shot. And yeah, she won't heal from like 0 health to like full health in 1 pulse shot now. And you know, it's not crazy, but it's only like one part of one thing of her kit, and she can still heal quite a bit, especially if you get bullet slaughter. But you know, it was enough for me to give her a -1.5. Okay, that's my review. Let me know what you think in the comments. Let me know if you think this patch is actually going to come west anytime soon, or before the AWC, or if they just going to package it into the larger patch when that comes out. As always, make sure if you're not subscribed already to press that subscribe button, press the bell, and go over to DTwoAOV.com if you want to read this article for yourself. See you guys later, and thanks for sticking around.